it's a marker. It's not really a wand. I do not own a wand. So, Harry Potter. Quite possibly one of the most popular fantasy stories of all time. And definitely the most popular fantasy story of our era. First, some background. The Harry Potter novels are written by J.K. Rowling. They tell the story of a young boy named Harry Potter who discovers one day that he's actually a wizard. And he goes to a magical school called Hogwarts to learn his magic spells and such. And he fights an evil wizard named Voldemort and, all that magical stuff. So, what is it that makes Harry Potter resonate with us so much? I think to really understand Harry Potter's popularity, you have to go back a bit. Quite a ways back, actually. Now, if you look at the sort of speculative fiction that was popular over the course of the 20th century, you'll notice definite trends and definite changes over time. For example, in the 70s, space opera was really popular. You had Star Wars, Star Trek, the original Battlestar Galactica. Space opera was basically fantasy in space. They're fantasy quest stories, but with a science fiction coat of paint. They're not very scientifically accurate. They're more concerned with just the wonder of space, the possibilities of exploring the stars. What I'm trying to say is space opera tends towards the more idealistic side of things. And as you move on to the 80s, you see a definite reaction to that. What kind of sci-fi and fantasy and whatnot was popular in the 80s? You had Terminator, Alien, Blade Runner, Labyrinth. There are these dark stories, these dark, nightmarish images. This was the decade that Neuromancer hit, and cyberpunk got real big. The world is dark and bleak. All these wondrous things that could do amazing things, all this technology, all this magic, can be twisted and used for horrible things. It can be used to invade your privacy, to destroy your individual self, to control everything about you. It can rise up against us. It can destroy us. What will we find when we go exploring out there? Will it be friendly? Maybe not. It might destroy us. The 80s at that time was very dark in terms of speculative fiction, most likely as a response to the optimism in the earlier decades. And then you get to the 90s, the decade Harry Potter was written. Now, Harry Potter has two obvious differences from the kind of speculative fiction that was popular in the 80s. First, it's a fantasy story, whereas the majority, not all, but the majority of speculative fiction in the 80s was science fiction. Harry Potter didn't try to have explanations. It was solely about, the first few books at least, not all the series, but the first few books were solely about just wonder. This whole sense of magic, that anything is possible, and wonderment and amazement. Which brings us to our second major difference, which is that Harry Potter was very optimistic. It was very idealistic. It was very lighthearted. Harry Potter was basically exactly what was needed after the dark period of sci-fi and fantasy that the 80s was. And, of course, the early 90s. So the book was written for children, but it still caught on with adults. I've partially already explained how Harry Potter fits in with cultural trends, with media trends, but there's one thing I didn't mention, which is quite simply that Harry Potter is very well written. J.K. Rowling is not a bad writer. She's very talented. And that was a huge strength. The series, yes, it was this children's series, but it took its subject matter and it took its readers seriously. It didn't try to talk down to them, and that made it popular both with the kids that it was aimed at and with the adults. It likely started just with adults who were reading what their kids were reading to find out, what they were up to. And then by word of mouth, it just spread. And suddenly, you had this story of this young wizard boy, which was just this cultural phenomenon. And obviously, once the films hit, Harry Potter reached a much wider audience and became much more popular. But how did Harry Potter keep the popularity? And this has been discussed many, many times. J.K. Rowling made sure that the Harry Potter books grew up with their audience. The early books, yes, were very childlike. They had very black and white morality. They had very, just this whole sense of wonder thing going on. There was no real attempt at examining the world. There was no real attempt at examining the characters. It was just a fairy tale, basically. But as the books progressed, they became much darker and much more mature. Until by the 7th book, you have blood and death just all over the place. No one really outgrew Harry Potter because the series grew up with them. And that was a huge strength and very clever of what Miss Rowling did. So, that being said, let's look at the actual quality of the books. I'm going to get hate mail for this. Most likely, if anyone watches this. But I did say earlier Harry Potter was well written. And I stand by that. The Harry Potter books are well written. They are good books. However, they are not good fantasy books. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Fantasy as a genre operates by certain rules, just like all genres do. And the most important rule of them all, the one that you can ignore any other rule in the genre as long as you obey this one rule. Be consistent with your world and your universe and your magic. It has to be consistent. It has to be well thought out. It has to make sense within the context of the story. And the world of Harry Potter doesn't. There is no reason provided in the text of the books to explain why the wizards are still in these medieval-style clothes and this medieval-style buildings. Why haven't they assimilated, technology and technological progress from the muggles, the non-magical people? Why did they just sort of stop developing around the Middle Ages? There's no real explanation for this. There's no explanation for why the wizards want to stay hidden from the rest of the world. There's no explanation for why wizards use entirely wands when guns are much quicker, much more effective. There's no real reason for why wizards seem to just, stay in their own separate corner. I mean, most wizards are completely clueless about the world around them, about anything non-magical. And why? Why don't they interact with Muggles more often? And then there's the Ministry of Magic in England. Is that the Ministry of all magic, or just magic in England? Does the British Empire still exist in the Potterverse, or are there other countries, their own governments that we don't see? And what are those other countries doing during the climax of the series? When the Ministry is taken over by Dark Wizards, why do we only learn about what's happening in England? There may be a couple throwaway lines regarding other countries, but there's no real explanation of what they're doing or how this affects them. It's like, in the Harry Potter universe, the United Kingdom is the only country where things really happen, which is odd. And there are also questions about how magic works, since you only really learn a couple rules for magic throughout the series, and they seem kind of arbitrary. Like, why can't you use a spell to turn into someone else? Why does that need to be a potion? Is there a reason for that? Why can't a spell do that? And if you can use magic to make an animal into a non-living, inanimate object with no life, and then use magic to turn it back into the same animal it was, why can't you bring the dead back to life? Because that seems like it's almost the same thing. You're taking life away and then putting it back. And how does the magic work? Why do certain words activate certain spells? Compare it to, say, the Dresden Files, which does explain a lot of these things. It explains how magic and advanced circuitry don't mix. Magic causes it to short circuit. The wizards are not ignorant of the rest of the world, for the most part. The only ones that really are ignorant are the older ones, because wizards live for hundreds of years. It explains how, magic doesn't require specific phrases. The phrases only exist to help the wizard focus. So different wizards will cast the same spell, but they'll use different magic words to cast it, because it's their own personal way of focusing. The problem with Harry Potter is that back when Rowling was writing a kid's book, she didn't put much thought into the world, only into what may be interesting, only into how to make the world seem magical. And as the story matured, and she began experimenting with this setting and the story she could tell in it, there were already a bunch of contradictions and just arbitrary limits. And there was no way to reconcile it with this new, more mature direction. But, as my family points out whenever I bring this topic up, I'm really just nitpicking here. It's very easy when reading Harry Potter or watching the movies to just ignore all that. And, hundreds of thousands of people have, and that's great for them. I really envy their ability to do that. They are not nearly as anal as I am. I mean, like, my little sister will watch Harry Potter 24/7 if she can. She's watched those movies so much that I have actually become completely sick of Harry Potter, because it's always playing every time I walk past the TV. But in the end, I really can't be too mad at Harry Potter. It's too sincere to really get angry at. And that, I think, is the series' biggest strength. It doesn't try to sucker you in. It doesn't try to trick you. It doesn't try to be something it's not. It knows exactly what it is. It's the story of a boy wizard growing up and his adventures. And that's all it tries to be. It doesn't really... There's no pretentiousness. There's no pretending or anything. It's just a single, sincere, heartfelt story. And in the end, you really can't get too angry about that. You really can't blame it for being that way. Harry Potter is basically the series that defined a generation, and I can see why. It hit at exactly the right moment. It struck all the right chords. It was sincere. It was well written. Really, there is no way it could not have been as successful as it was. And that's my 2 cents.